Yeah.
Great, okay. Well, thanks for having me here today. It's a real pleasure. I've been watching some of the webinars myself, so it's really nice to be able to do one back. I'm Debbie. I am a mammologist, I suppose, really. I've got a history of working with bats, small mammals, and hedgehogs, which I would class as slightly bigger than a small mammal, particularly as I've studied harvest mice in particular. So today I was just going to talk a little bit about hedgehog ecology, potentially reasons why they're in decline, and ways that we might be able to help hedgehogs in our everyday lives and also across the wider landscape. So to start with, hedgehogs are in the Eulipotophyla order of things, which is a bit unusual. They used to be classed as the insectivores, but that is now a bit more defunct. In England, they're most closely related to things such as moles and shrews. And you can probably get that just by thinking about what they look like. They've got that long, low nose that helps them to seek out their invertebrate prey under the, on or under the ground. Elsewhere in the world, they're related to a wide variety of other animals. And these are quite exciting, some of them to us, quite exotic. We've got the desmans, which are diving insectivores. They're really cool. You find them in Russia and other places in the world. And we also have a whole other world of mole-like shrews and shrew-like moles. Unfortunately, I can't go into that today because that would be a much longer talk, but it is fascinating if you do want to Google it later. There are also the moon rats, which are called the hairy hedgehogs. They're not so spiky, they're hairy, that are often found in jungles. So do have a Google later about those other fascinating things that our hedgehogs are related to. So hedgehog type animals appeared in the Eocene epoch in time. So to kind of put it in context, this is basically the period of time after the Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs famously died out about 50 million years ago. But hedgehogs, as we know them recognisably, probably around 15 to 20 million years ago. However, in 2016, the fossilised remains of a described as spiny hedgehog-like mammal was found in Spain, Spinalestes xenarthrosis. And that's making us kind of rethink where hedgehogs might fit in our evolutionary tree. And in fact, maybe they've been around a lot longer than we originally thought. Hopefully, more findings will shed some light on that. So across the world, we have arguably 17 different species of hedgehogs, and they're split into 5 groups or genera. So there are just some examples here, just to give you a flavour of the different hedgehogs that you might see across the world. So at the top left here, we've got the northern white-breasted hedgehog. Hopefully you can see this looks quite similar to our hedgehog. It's actually part of the same group, but it's got this white band going across the chest there. That's found in Eastern Europe mostly, and it has been known to hybridize with our hedgehog, which I'll talk about in a bit. Over here on the top right, you've got the four-toed hedgehog that's found in Africa. This might be highly recognizable to some of you, mostly because it has been bred for the pet trade, the African pygmy hedgehog. So you may have seen it on videos on YouTube, Facebook, etc. People now keep them as pets. In fact, they're very popular in America, where they don't actually have native hedgehogs. They used to have a Hedgehogs Olympics, and they would breed these hedgehogs to have certain characteristics to win certain games. We don't have that anymore, but they're still making popular pets here across the pond. You've got other hedgehogs too, so you can see this one down here, the Daurian hedgehog, possibly one of my favourite hedgehogs. It's a very beefy hedgehog, built for survival in the cold environments in which it lives in Mongolia and China. And then we've got these 2 other groups. These hedgehogs look quite similar in the sense that they've both got very big, long ears and quite long legs as well. And this is to help them find their invertebrate prey in the deserts in which they live, and to help them cover enough ground to find enough food. We do also have other spiky animals in the world. So you might know of tenrecs, probably porcupines, and also echidnas. However, these aren't actually related to our hedgehogs. They're what we call an example of a convergent evolution, where different animals evolved the same adaptation but independently of each other to survive, in this case, spikes. So in the UK, we only have one type of wild hedgehog, and this is the hedgehog here, the West European hedgehog, that hopefully looks familiar to you all, arguably the most attractive of all the species of hedgehog. And as I said, it's in that same group, the Erinaceus group, is the white-breasted hedgehog. So this hedgehog is very widely distributed across Western Europe, and also going more a bit to the north and the east. As I mentioned, it does hybridize sometimes. And it's also very widely dispersed across the UK, as you can see there. We do get variations in the colour of our species of hedgehogs. So we get white hedgehogs with black eyes and black noses. We get albino hedgehogs. We get hedgehogs with quite a few white spines. And we also get blonde hedgehogs, like you can see up here. They are quite rare, caused by recessive genes, but they're more common in some places than others. For instance, in the island of Alderney, where presumably a founding population that was quite small had quite a high prevalence of the recessive genes there. So that's always quite exciting if you do manage to see one of those. Hedgehogs are described as omnivores. They mostly eat invertebrates, and they eat invertebrates that are largely inactive at ground level that they can reach. They're not that fast and flighty to be able to catch things like grasshoppers, but they can eat a lot of grubs. And one of their, well, probably the most important food to a hedgehog is the earthworm. It's packed full of nutrition and also moisture. They like to eat these all year round. They're seasonally available throughout the time that they are awake and not in hibernation. So they're a staple food of the hedgehog. Other than that, they eat a wide range of other invertebrates. So particularly things like beetles are quite good food for hedgehogs. They like them. And this means that their droppings are actually quite identifiable. And they're a good field sign that you've got hedgehogs around, as not many other things look like it. So you can see a dropping here. This is actually quite a fresh one on the right-hand side up here. So it looks quite wet. Often you'll find them that are a bit more dried out than this. I do have an example here. I'm hoping you'll be able to see. I can't see my screen, so I can't see if you can see it. Let me know if you can't, but hopefully you can. So you can see it's quite small. It's about the size of your little finger or a bit smaller than that. And it's full of the crunched up remains of the beetle exoskeleton. So it shines, it glistens in the light. And that's a key attribute of hedgehog droppings. Of course, it's going to depend on what they're eating, but certainly if they've been eating some crunchy invertebrates, this is a classic hedgehog dropping. You normally only find them in ones or twos and not anywhere particularly obvious, unfortunately. They don't mark their territory. They don't have territories in the same way that things like foxes do. So they're quite opportunistic if you come across them. But they are a good sign that hedgehogs are around. In weather like we have had, obviously not today, she says now that it's raining, but say last week and the week before, we've had very hot temperatures. Earthworms tend to burrow very deep underground, and hedgehogs can't really access them. So they'll be looking for alternative sources of food, for example, millipedes and earwigs and other things. They tend to be available later in the year. So they do eat mostly insects. They will sometimes eat other things. So they'll eat carrion, they'll eat eggs sometimes, and they'll eat bits and pieces, so say of frogs if they come across a dead frog or something like that, and they will eat those quite readily. Hence they're called omnivores, and they're very generalist eaters and opportunistic. They've got a very good sense of smell. You can see that the hedgehog's nose here quite low and close to the ground, and also an excellent sense of hearing to help them hear that invertebrate prey. And in fact, we think that they can hear much higher sounds that we can, again, which help them to find these invertebrates. Their eyesight is not so great, and that's why they're often at least partly involved in accidents in gardens, things like falling in ponds and things like that. So hedgehogs on average live about 2 years in the wild, which often surprises people. It's not that long. If you're getting a hedgehog that's about 5 years old, then it's doing quite well in the wild. In captivity, they've been known to live for at least 14 years, but they're leading a very pampered existence. And I suspect they're eating quite soft, non-gritty food. Often this is the cause for hedgehogs dying. If it's natural causes, because they get their teeth ground down by all that grit that comes in with the earthworms, and they're no longer able to feed. But on average, about 2 years. So about now, we've got lots of baby hedgehogs or hoglets about. They're born in the summertime, usually in litters of about 4 or 5, after a gestation period of about 4 weeks. They remain in the nest with mum for about 4 weeks, and they suckle on her milk. And then they'll start to come out for little foraging expeditions to learn what they can and can't eat. And then by about 6 to 8 weeks, they'll actually be independent, and the young will go off and lead their own solitary lives. By the time we get to the autumn, we are actually sometimes seeing second litters. So this is likely to be the case this year because we had early warm spells, which meant that our hedgehogs bred quite early, and therefore they're probably going to try and squeeze in a second litter. This can be good because it can really boost hedgehog numbers, but the young have got quite a task on their hands to be able to feed up enough to get to hibernate and to get to a good weight to hibernate so that they actually survive over the hibernation period. The males and females around the autumn will be busy fattening up, ready to go into hibernation. Hibernation happens usually in about November time until about April-ish time. We sometimes describe it in a simplistic way as like sleep, but it's actually quite a different state to sleep, and it's really fascinating. If you do want to know some of the facts, I would recommend this book written by hedgehog expert Pat Morris. It's brilliant. It's got lots of facts about hibernation if you're that way inclined like myself. But essentially everything slows down in the hedgehog's body. They even sometimes go into periods of apnea where they don't breathe for minutes, sometimes hours at a time. And this is all to conserve energy whilst there's not that much food about. And then they'll wake up in the spring when it starts to get warm and there's more prey about. Of course, in the spring, they're going to be really, really hungry. They'll have lost up to 1/3 of their body weight. They're very active, looking for food, but also looking for each other because it's the mating season, which is actually a really good time to notice hedgehogs, normally because they're so loud and vocal. So hedgehog courtship is not particularly elaborate. It's not particularly romantic either. Males will roam around looking for females. Sometimes they'll travel up to 3 kilometres in a single evening looking for food and females. Their home ranges, as it were, often overlap, and they'll try and find as many females as they can and mate with them, which in itself is quite a tricky business because they're rather prickly customers. So to woo the female, the male tends to circle her, while sometimes she headbutts him away. Eventually, she might acquiesce and they can get down to the business of mating. Both males and females are promiscuous. They have multiple partners, and actually sometimes the females have litters that are made up of babies with different paternities. And it's thought that this helps to increase the genetic resistance, as it were, in the population. After that, they go their separate ways. There's no paternal care for the young from the dad, and they may well never see each other again. So the result of this, hopefully, is some hoglets. So you can see here, hoglets are actually born looking like they don't have any spikes. They do, they're just underneath essentially what's a sack of skin. So it allows the mum to give birth without crying. Then you start to get these baby spikes coming through, as you can see here, just after a couple of hours, they're cream and a bit softer and thinner than their adult spikes. They're very small, sort of 20 grams or so, 4 or 5 in a litter, as I say. And then they start to get their more adult spikes coming through, the coloration of the adult spikes. They're very vulnerable at this stage in the nest to predation, even from things like corvids. They can't actually roll up until they're about 11 days old, and even then it's not a proper roll. You can see here there's actually quite a lot of exposed hedgehog here because they don't have the skin or the muscles to do so yet. Their eyes and ears are born shut and sealed, and they don't open really until about 2 weeks old. And you can see here there's this round bit of skin here, this circle of skin, and you can also see it on this young hedgehog here. This is what we call a skirt of skin, and it hangs over the orbicularis muscle. And this is a really cool muscle in a hedgehog that works a bit like a drawstring bag, allowing it to pull itself into that characteristic ball to defend itself. Hedgehog spikes themselves are actually really cool. They're banded hollow spikes made of a keratin type substance like our hair. And they're each rounded at the bottom. They've got a basal bulb which stops them going back into the hedgehog on impact, very important. But they're each attached to individual muscles, which then attach to a sheet muscle on the back. And essentially this means that the hedgehog can raise its spikes in ever so slightly different angles to the ones next to them. So they're sort of all crisscrossing, and this forms a really, really formidable defense against predators. Hedgehogs make 3 kinds of nests. So the top one here is the beginnings of a summer nest. Often it's just grass that's been pulled over the hedgehog to protect it in the day. Males frequently make these in the summer when they're roaming around a lot looking for females. The hibernation nest, the hibernacula, are a lot more substantial, and they're made usually of deciduous leaves. They're built to last, hopefully, over most of the winter. Hedgehogs collect up these leaves in their mouths into layers, and then they kind of run in and make a nice little snug ball for themselves. They're often put under things like bramble or sheds, things that will protect them from the elements, and also to protect them from wind blowing them away as well. They can be sort of 30 to 60 centimetres wide. They're quite substantial structures, but often they're quite well hidden. Then there are the nursery nests. So these are the ones that the mums use to raise their young. They're often made of leaves and sometimes grass and sometimes softer things like shredded bits of paper or moss to insulate them and make them nice for the babies when they arrive, like this one you can see on the right. So that hedgehog that I just showed you was out in the day. People often get worried about hedgehogs out in the day because they know that they are nocturnal animals. But sometimes, like that mum, if they're moving back and forth with material in their mouths to the same place, it might just be that they're a bit disorganised, they're about to have some babies, and they haven't made the nest yet, so they might be okay. Also, equally, sometimes the females, when they're lactating, they stay close to the nest, but they sometimes just come out to have a little bit of a break, but they go back relatively soon. But if you are worried, there are some things to look out for. For instance, are there any obvious injuries? Hedgehogs don't sunbathe, walk in circles, or walk really wobbly most of the time. These can be signs of parasites or infections, or even poisoning. They don't really cough unless they've got lungworm, which sounds very much like our own hacking cough. And although most of our hedgehogs do have fleas and ticks, they're not usually overwhelmed by them. This can be a sign that they've got some underlying condition going on. Also, hedgehogs are generally quite round. If they look rather elongated and thin, then they might be a bit poorly. So if you are concerned, there is a hedgehog hotline that you can call from the BHPS, the British Hedgehog Preservation Society, which you can see down there. Okay, so I mentioned before they're not territorial. They do have home ranges. It can be up to 50 hectares for a male in the summer season, for instance, usually more around 30 hectares. The female hedgehogs have smaller ones at about 10. They tend to stay closer to their young for obvious reasons. Hedgehogs live in quite low densities. You don't generally find more than one per hectare. In urban areas, it tends to be better habitat now, and you need fewer hedgehogs in a smaller space to make a sustainable population. So sometimes people want to release hedgehogs where there aren't any because they think it would be nice, and they release a couple of hedgehogs there. But in reality, that's not really a sustainable population genetically, and you need to be thinking of kind of releasing normally about 40 at a time in an urban area. And this shoots up massively to more than 100 hedgehogs in more rural areas. So we do need to be mindful of that and what makes a population likely to survive. I mentioned a bit about hedgehogs liking urban areas and gardens, and they are one of the few animals that like to live alongside us in our gardens, which is fantastic and gives people that connection with them that really makes us think that they're the best animal, and they have been voted as Britain's favourite mammal multiple times. They do generally nest near buildings, and particularly in rural landscapes we see that pattern. They forage along hedgerows, and they tend to avoid the big arable fields that we'll talk a bit about later. Unfortunately, though, our hedgehogs are suffering from a serious decline. So here in Britain, we know that since the millennium, we've lost about a third of our hedgehogs. We think that this decline is more serious in rural areas where we've lost about 50%. In urban areas, the picture is looking like it might be getting a little bit better. So although we've lost hedgehogs from lots of areas where they're still clinging on, we've actually sometimes seen an increase in weekly numbers. And this could be, it's hard to tell, it's just a correlation, we don't know, but potentially this means that some of the community projects that we've got going that encourage people to look after their urban hedgehogs are having a bit of an impact. This decline, though, means that in Britain, we have now labelled them as vulnerable, but elsewhere in the world, the IUCN has declared them as of least concern. So the reasons for the decline are actually quite complicated, and they're all sort of interwoven, and some of them are more important locally in places than others. And this makes it quite hard for us to tackle the decline. So we've lost a lot of our hedgerows in rural areas, and of course we're building a lot in the more urban areas, which means that this isn't just very good habitat for our hedgehogs to live. Roadkill is thought to be a major factor now. It's thought that we might lose up to 335,000 hedgehogs a year on our roads in Britain, which, when you think that we've probably got a population of less than 1 million, is massive. So obviously there's direct mortality from the cars, but also there's the fact that this fragments their habitat. And this is exacerbated, particularly in urban areas, by the fact that we now build a lot of brick walls and we use gravel board fencing, and hedgehogs simply can't get through. If you think about what I said earlier about hedgehogs needing maybe 20 to 30 gardens in their home range to find enough food and to find each other, they need to be able to live in a connected landscape and get through. There's also competition from other animals. So badgers are quite contentious and they often get the blame for hedgehog decline. We know that badgers have probably doubled in number and hedgehogs have suffered a massive decline. And we also know that badgers eat hedgehogs. So the temptation is to say that badgers have caused this decline. In reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. Yes, they do sometimes eat hedgehogs, but also importantly, they eat the same food as hedgehogs, and a badger will eat 5 times the amount of worms as a hedgehog, for instance. So if you're in an area where there is a high density of badgers and potentially not that much food, there could be a knock-on effect for hedgehogs. Nationally, however, it seems to be less of a running factor that we've got the badgers there. So in areas, for instance, East Anglia, where you don't have many badgers, we're still seeing the same level of hedgehog decline. So we need to be mindful of that and not sort of just blame it all on the badgers, and potentially look to be improving habitat for both of the species. There's also a lack of food. So we've learned our lessons, you would hope, about pesticide poisoning, although that's very debatable and stuff is still going on. But more than that, really, if you're spraying pesticides in not just farmland, but in your own garden, you're actually removing a food source for hedgehogs, which is going to have a knock-on effect potentially. Hedgehogs are taken into rescue centres with a wide variety of normally human-related injuries. So they get caught up in strimmers and mowers, they get burnt on bonfires, they get bitten by dogs, they fall and catch themselves in litter, they fall in ponds and can't get out. And we really don't know the impacts of these injuries on populations, but we do know anecdotally that they get reported a lot. There's also the potential for climate change to impact hedgehogs. So with weather becoming warmer, this actually might increase the number of invertebrates that we get. So that's a lot of food, and increase the period of time that hedgehog can be awake without having to go into hibernation. However, if hedgehogs are awoken a lot in hibernation from warm periods like we've been seeing in the winters, which then suddenly drop and they have to go back into hibernation, this can be a massive waste of energy for hedgehogs. It takes a lot for them to wake up from hibernation, up to 5 hours, uses a lot of energy for them, which they're eventually going to run out of. So it's more these fluctuating temperatures across the winter season that might be a problem for our hedgehogs. I've mentioned the injuries that hedgehogs get. They're also prone to diseases, things like fungal infections like ringworm, lungworm I mentioned before. They get all kinds of worms, fleas and ticks, and those kinds of things that might be having an impact as well. And I did talk a bit about pesticide poisoning, but also something that's on the radar is rodenticides. So actually quite a large percentage of hedgehogs that have been analysed from roadkill and other studies have shown to have rodenticides in them. And rodenticides don't really break down in the animal when it dies, so levels can build when you have something like a hedgehog eating potentially not just the animal that it's killed, but also the maggots and things that are feeding off it can get a kind of double dose. And these poisons could be laid down in the fat of the hedgehog, which it then metabolizes to wake up from hibernation or during hibernation. So it could get a massive bump of those rodenticides at any one time. So we don't really know the impacts of that, and that's something that's new and emerging for us to look into. That's all really depressing, but there are absolutely loads of ways that you can get involved in helping hedgehogs. So there's a picture of me starting out on my hedgehog journey, engaging communities in conservation. You can see some hedgehog biscuits there. Our projects have ended in Warwickshire now, sadly, but there are lots of others that you can get involved with depending on where you are. There's a project in Gloucestershire at the moment. There's one in Glasgow, one down in Surrey. There's a national project, Hedgehog Street, a coalition between the British Hedgehog Preservation Society and People's Trust for Endangered Species. Great project. You can sign up as a hedgehog champion. There are over 40,000 of them across the country. You get loads of resources about hedgehogs, tips on what you can do, and ways to talk to your neighbours and friends about them. You can also record your hedgehog sightings on their big hedgehog map that help us to look at where hedgehogs are and crucially where we're not tending to see them. At the moment, they've got an initiative on called Hedgehogs After Dark. So do look that up on Facebook and social media if you're around, where they're asking you to report instances of sightings and behaviours that hedgehogs are displaying at the moment. Also, there is the BHPS that I've mentioned before. They also have a list of registered hedgehog carers and a wide range of information on hedgehogs there. Hugh Warwick is a hedgehog-loving ecologist and author. He campaigns a lot using social media, so it's worth having a look at him. He does have his own website, and also he has a great book. I'd recommend this, a nice easy read, very entertaining if you want to have a read about hedgehogs. And the Royal Park, so Regent's Park has a monitoring programme that goes on in May and September, and you can get involved in this as well. So in terms of finding out where our hedgehogs are, I've mentioned that droppings aren't particularly useful. They're great if you find them, but you can't reliably go looking for them, as is the case for regular footprints. But you can set footprint tunnels, which are a great and really fun thing to do. It's essentially a plastic tube that you put along some kind of edge that hedgehog snuffles around. You bait it with some smelly hedgehog food or meaty cat and dog food, and then you paint some ink down the side of it. I use a really fine charcoal mixed with vegetable oil, so it's not going to harm anything. Put some paper inside it, put that plate in the tunnel, and leave it overnight. And hopefully you will get some hedgehog tracks if there are hedgehogs in your area. Scientific method said you need to do this for 5 nights at a time to see if you've got hedgehogs in an area. And that's a hedgehog footprint there. A hedgehog foot there, which gives these hedgehog footprints. So they are very much like a small child's hand footprint. Hopefully you can just about see that they've got 5 digits. You often lose the 5th one. And they've got these really broad pads here in the middle, which is unlike anything else. It's particularly unlike the rodents that they often get mistaken for. They've also got what we call a plantigrade stance, and this means that their whole foot bears the weight when they stand on it, so you get a nice full-on footprint, not just the toes or the backs. Their rear feet are more narrow than their front feet, and you can kind of tell how they've been walking from looking at the footprints. Often, I have to say, they don't come out as clear as this. They're quite messy. They'll sometimes sit in the ink and then smudge it all over. But these are the prints that you're looking for. But it's great fun just to be able to look at the different footprints and the different animals that have been visiting. I would, of course, recommend the amazing FSC field guide on tracks and signs. I believe there is a sale now on, a bit of promo there. Mine's covered in mud, as any mammologist should be, really. And you can have a look at the different footprints that you find there. There's also some information on the PTES website for that too. And I think there's a Tracks and Signs event coming up, as Holly mentioned earlier, as a webinar. So in order to get an idea of numbers, because the footprint tunnels can only really tell you whether a hedgehog is there or not. Maybe if you've got a little one and a bigger one, but not much about how many. You really need to employ other methods, usually which require licensing. You can trap them. I've not done this myself. You can also radio tag them and GPS tag them. And there's a new method at the moment that's been tested that uses remote cameras. But the one that we tend to do, and one of the more reliable methods, is torchlight surveying. So I'm just going to show you a video now done by Simon Watts of Wild Presentations, which is just a short clip which shows you what we do on our torchlight surveys. So I'm hoping this will work. Okay, so there you go, a great little video there by Simon, and hopefully it gave you a flavour as to what's involved in our torchlight surveys. So essentially we go out in small groups, and we go out with big torches, and we quietly look for hedgehogs and listen, of course, because they do make characteristic snuffling and other noises. And when we find them, we health check them, sex them, weigh them, measure them, and see how they're getting on. And then we mark them with numbered plastic shrink tubes. So this allows us to monitor the populations over time, and we do this every May and September, not this May, sadly, because of COVID, but hopefully we'll be back out there in September. And this gives us loads of information really on how our hedgehogs are doing. One of the things it can tell us is an idea of home range, and of course also their favourite areas and the different places that we survey. So don't worry too much about this map over here. It's really looking at at least the foraging ranges, but just a few examples. You can see the green here is quite small in some places and bigger than others, and really this shows that over time the range of this young male changed. So it actually got bigger in the spring compared to the previous autumn when he was a youngster, and because by then he was an adult male roaming around looking for females. On the flip side of that, you can see an adult female in pink. You can see this is a massive range she's got going on here. And that's when it was the autumn, when she was busy desperately trying to feed up after she'd lost body condition from having a litter, and put on enough weight to survive the winter. So they can tell us all sorts really, but we use this information to inform the green spaces where we survey. So you can see here, this is actually one of the favourite areas where we find loads of hedgehogs. It's under veteran trees, basically really old trees, so there's lots of invertebrates around on the ground. And we told the green space about this, and they kindly now don't mow as much around the base of these trees, just to boost that invertebrate diversity and abundance. We've also put hedgehog crossing signs over this driveway here. It's only very small, it's not a main road, but we do get road casualties, so we've put some signs up to alert people about that. It's also nice because we can follow the stories, as it were, of certain hedgehogs. One of them you can see here, Basil. He had a festering wound that had probably been caused by a strimmer, and we actually took him in to rehabilitate him at carers, and then I was able to release him later on back in the same place where he was found. And I then found him the following season doing really, really well. He was a whopping 1,200 grams, just about to go into hibernation, had obviously had a nice summer season, and hopefully he'd been out there making some babies with some females. So we do still run these surveys in Warwickshire. Have a look at the Warwickshire Mammal Group website for more information, and there is also still that project going on in Regent's Park, so do Google that if you're anywhere near there. So when we're thinking about habitat for hedgehogs, once we know where they are or where they aren't, it's basically a win-win, because if we know that they're not there, we can try and improve habitat for them to make them go there. But if there is good habitat there, we can still always improve it really. So we just need to think like a hedgehog. So we need to think that the landscape needs to be connected for them. They need to have access to that wide landscape that we talked about earlier, maybe 50 hectares for one hedgehog even. So we need to make sure there's not barriers like brick walls and gravel boards. They also need access to food and water, somewhere to shelter, and of course they need the area to be relatively safe, so maybe free of lots of litter, somewhere they're not going to be stringed, etc. So I'm just going to go through some top 10 tips that you can do in your own gardens or green spaces to encourage hedgehogs and make it a better place for them in your gardens. So if you take away nothing else from today apart from this, it's to make hedgehog holes in the base of your fences. So these only need to be about 13 by 13 centimetres. That's about the size of a CD. Kids look at me like I'm crazy when I say that these days, so I'll say both. But that will let the biggest of hedgehogs through. Obviously, you need permission from your neighbours to do this, and you need it on as many different fences that lead into different places as possible to maximise your connections. If you're finding it difficult because you've got concrete at the bottom, you don't have a massive drill to get through it, you can make a little ramp or a little mound underneath and cut through the wood on top. If you're worried about other things getting through than just hedgehogs, you can make sort of little tunnels to exclude other things. But really things like cats are going to jump over your fence anyway, to be honest. Lawns are very good for hedgehogs. People think a crop lawn actually is a bit of a desert for most wildlife, but actually they provide easy access for hedgehogs to get lots of worms and other food. But it's nice if you can incorporate some other species in there that can grow and be shorter. Things like clover, self-heal, bird's-foot, trefoil. Also, if you can leave an area of your lawn to grow long and encourage wildflowers in there, that's brilliant, because that really increases invertebrate diversity and abundance, and also it provides a potential summer nesting site. So be sure to check that lawn before you mow, because there might be a hedgehog resting in the bottom of it. So just walk through carefully and make sure that there's nothing there before you get the mower on it. Shrubs and climbers are great habitat for hedgehogs, mostly because if they're well developed, they can provide a base area for a hedgehog to nest. Shrubs are brilliant, particularly if they're low growing and dense. They might even hibernate in places like that. And also, when you cut things and do other things, you can make it into compost. Again, they like to nest in areas like this, so do be careful if you turn your compost when you stick a fork in. Just make sure there are no hedgehogs in there first. Ponds are obviously a great source of water for loads of wildlife, and therefore a source of invertebrates as well. But do make a ramp in them. It could be just from logs or bricks or whatever. Just make sure that hedgehogs can get out again. They're excellent swimmers, but they do struggle to get out, and then they will drown, unfortunately. So just make it safe. Hedges are fantastic for hedgehogs. I can't emphasize this enough. They provide a source of food, shelter, and connectivity. That's how hedgehogs make their way around the landscape, by hugging the edges of things like hedges. So do try and make sure that you can have a hedge, ideally instead of a fence if you can. Plant it up with native species, so things like holly, hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, and the thorny ones of those actually provide a great defence against burglars anyway, so they're practical for us as well as hedgehogs. Dead hedges themselves, made up of dead material, can also provide shelter and corridors for hedgehogs to use. Please do try and use natural methods of pest control if you're going to use any methods. I've talked a bit about spraying. I can't go into it too much now. I watched a fabulous talk last night from Dave Goulson on the impacts of pesticides on our landscape, partly. Fascinating and worrying at the same time. Try not to use them if you can. There are lots of natural pest deterrents. So for instance, you can put copper tape around your pot plants, or wool pellets, and this slugs don't like to cross this, so they'll hopefully not go over the top. You can use ferric phosphate iron-based pellets rather than metaldehyde. If you really want to use metaldehyde or other pellets, just try and make sure they're under something that's only slightly raised so the hedgehogs can't get inside. So if you put the pellets here and just raise it a tiny bit, the slugs could get in, but the hedgehogs couldn't lift over that slab. And of course, as I mentioned before, please do try and avoid rodenticides. Log piles are a great habitat for hedgehogs. They provide loads of bugs for them to eat, and also a potential shelter for them to nest. If you do make your logs and things up into piles for a bonfire, please don't just light it if it's been sitting there. Check for hedgehogs or move it first. It's a great place for them to hibernate in, even at particularly at bonfire night time of year, but you don't want to set light to them. Hedgehog houses are often gifted to people. I get lots of questions about hedgehog houses. There was a hedgehog housing census done, which told us really that we should ideally put them in within 5 meters of a house, but in a quiet spot, and leave some bedding nearby. So you know that hedgehogs make their nests out of leaves, things like lime and cherry are some of their favourites. If you don't have trees, you've not got enough space, maybe just leave some pet hay nearby that they can use. Ideally, your hedgehog house will have a tunnel or a baffle inside, which is a bit of a divide down the middle, which helps to exclude other animals and predators. And if you do feel the need to clean it, try and do that in between hibernation and breeding season, so about March or April, when you're less likely to disturb your hedgehogs. Okay, elsewhere, rather than just in gardens, we do try and do some landscape scale work to complement the garden work. So I've done a lot of work with local authorities, for instance, in trying to get them to make their amenity grassland sites good for wildlife as well as people. So having areas of that are for wildlife, and become more diverse in plants and therefore the invertebrates that use them. So like letting some areas grow long and having wildflower meadows, and also planting some trees to provide some nesting habitat in the long run. Also opening them up, making sure that they are easily accessible to hedgehogs. And of course, doing lots of planting and maintenance of hedges. So we lay hedges when they get to sort of 10 or 12 years oldish, so that we can regenerate the growth and make them bushy at the bottom, because that's what you want to provide a good habitat for hedgehogs. Obviously, we get a lot of building in urban areas. Traditionally, they've kind of been deserts for hedgehogs, these new housing estates, potentially not great habitat. But because hedgehogs do actually like to live alongside us, there's the potential for what we call a habitat net gain. Because if you build on barren, not very good rural land that hedgehogs aren't really using anyway, and then you go and make a housing estate on it, those gardens can actually be a great habitat for hedgehogs if done right. So the key thing here is that we ask for hedgehog holes to be put in the base of the fences so that they're accessible. Also, other features are great. So landscape corridors within them, putting in deadwood, leaves, ponds, all those kind of things are great. And we really strongly encourage that in planning applications. So a number of ways that you can get hedgehogs considered in the planning process. It's a bit complicated to go into now, but there is a great book. I say it's great because I wrote it with the PTES, that is downloadable from the PTS's website, and I think also the BHPS. It was done with Hedgehog Street. So that's free guidance for builders and planners on how they can factor hedgehogs into development, and it's got everything you need in there. There is actually now national guidance to include hedgehogs in the planning process. Otherwise, in the rural landscape, there are lots of things that you can do. I've said enough about hedges, I'm sure, but obviously including more hedges that are good quality and being sure to cut them on rotation so that they don't just die is really important. Having the field margins next to hedges, a great place for the hedgehogs to forage and maybe nest in the summer. Having areas of scrub, again, great nesting habitat, and deadwood and leaf litter. Trying to be organic and avoiding all those chemicals. Also, reducing tillage is really important. So ploughing can actually really reduce the number and diversity of particularly earthworms that you get, and it really compacts the soil. So reducing the amount that we do this is quite important for a wide variety of wildlife. Cattle grids now should have ramps. If you buy a new cattle grid, it should conform to the British standard and have a ramp in so that hedgehogs don't fall in and get stuck. If you do see any old ones, you can retrofit some ramps, or even just a pile of vegetation or something to help the hedgehog climb out. Cutting vegetation for hedgehogs is really hard. Obviously, you've got to take into account the other management, but generally we would say cut the long grass in the winter, because hedgehogs aren't normally nesting in it in the winter. They'll be nesting in shrubs and bushes. Cut the bramble in the autumn, so after bird nesting season and you've had the berries, but just before hibernation season, because they do love to hibernate in dense bramble thickets. There's the option to potentially graze wildflower meadows with livestock rather than cut them, because this avoids what's sometimes referred to as the death cut somewhat dramatically. The cut in July, which can really hurt hedgehogs if they're nesting in that long grass at that time. If you do need to cut it rather than graze it, cut it from the inside outwards so animals can escape out and disperse out into the countryside. But also you can do a high cut at first, check for hedgehogs, and then do a lower cut after that. Either way, always check for hedgehogs ideally. Anything that you do, try and do it on rotation and leave different areas of habitat for our hedgehogs around. Crucial thing is to have a habitat matrix for hedgehogs. They use a wide variety of habitats at different stages, and actually they might move through these different habitats seasonally. So an Irish study found, for example, they start off mostly using pastoral fields, then they move more onto the arable edges, and then they use scrub as they're coming into the hibernation season. So try and make sure you have different diverse patches of habitat wherever you can that are connected across the landscape. That's about it in my whirlwind talk that I realise I have gone quite fast to try and put stuff in there. Pretty much all the resources and links to the different websites and institutions that I've talked about are on here. I did work for Warwickshire Wildlife Trust for about 4 or 5 years as a hedgehog officer, so I've put everything up there. There's loads of freely downloadable resources, lesson plans for teachers, leaflets, videos, anything you want to know about hedgehogs, head over to this website here. If you did want to sign up for the Torchlight surveys in Warwickshire, have a look at the Warwickshire Mammal Group website, just Google it, it'll come up straight away. And also my details are on there, you can contact me through that. And also a bit of a plug, I am a wildlife artist, as are some of my drawings in these presentations. If you did want to have a look at buying some of the wildlife art, there's a range of products, for instance, face masks, artwork itself, like pictures, mugs, things like that, and then please do head on over to the store. But other than that, thank you very much for listening, and please do hit me with some of your questions. I'll try and answer as many as I can, as accurately as I can.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that. That was great, and we've already got lots of questions already. I'm just gonna read through the chat now. There were some earlier. Oh, I can't find it. So Chloe was asking, I know there are a few people answering this in the chat, but I'm going to ask it anyway for the benefit of those people not paying attention to the chat. Chloe was asking, when they have litters, can there be hoglets from different males in the same litter? And if so, how does this happen?
Yes, definitely, there can. So it's a mechanism actually that they think increases the genetic fitness of the hedgehog population. So you can get litters with multiple paternity in there with the young. I'm not quite sure biologically how it works. I think I'd have to look into the science of that, but the females will mate with multiple males at any one time. They often have about 5 partners each during the mating season. And without going into too much detail, the males don't leave a kind of plug in the female like other animals do. So they are able to be inseminated, as it were, by other males, and therefore they can get the mixed litters.
Well, we've got another question about litters from Iona. She's asking, can hedgehogs mate with their siblings, or they only mate with others from different litters?
That's a really good question. I don't really know if this has been looked into too much. There's certainly not been a lot of research on it. Hedgehogs do disperse quite far and wide, presumably to spread the genes and avoid kind of inbreeding, as it were, between the populations. So the juveniles should disperse quite far outwards, and therefore they're unlikely to mate with their brother or sister, because they will also disperse quite far away. So it probably doesn't happen that often. Whether they can recognise their siblings is probably a different question. They've got an excellent sense of smell, so it might be, we do think that they communicate with each other through smell and through leaving markers, and they've certainly got glands on their feet and by their anuses, so it might be that they can recognise other hedgehogs as well.
Brilliant, thank you. We had a question. Oh, you're talking about roadkill being a big issue earlier. Rosalind was asking, is part of the roadkill issue because hedgehogs like to follow specific routes, so will continue to do so even if it's been replaced by a road?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So some hedgehogs do seem to be quite habitual. People do often report the same hedgehog coming around to their garden at exactly 9 p.m, following the same route around. Actually, sometimes this turns out to be many different hedgehogs. It's just coincidental, and people think it's the same hedgehog because they look the same. But hedgehogs do vary in their habits. It's been shown in food studies, so they might not be as habitual as we think. They don't necessarily have sort of communal crossing points, as it were, which makes it much harder to mitigate for on roads, because if they choose a kind of logical place to cross, then we could put mechanisms in place to try and deviate them away from these, but they tend to just kind of cross where they want, whenever they want, which means that we're going to have to try and funnel them across. And there is research being done at the moment as to how we might do that and get them to use tunnels underneath the roads that other animals sometimes use. at the moment. I think the jury's out. I don't think the results have been finished yet, but it's looking like they can't be funneled that easily. They're quite willful animals, hedgehogs. They tend to do what they want when they want, and don't really conform to what we'd like them to do.
Well, thank you. Fiona was asking, you said there's been a decline of 30% in urban areas and 50% in rural areas since 2000. Thinking of shifting baselines, what's the overall decline since perhaps the 70s or an earlier time, do you know?
Again, an excellent question. So there are a lot of statistics out there. There's a lot of claims like there used to be 30 million hedgehogs, now there's only 1 million. A lot of these estimates are based on somewhat spurious data from before. The fact really is, like a lot of species that were at least common, people didn't really report seeing hedgehogs. So we actually have very poor baseline data for them. We really don't know that much about them, say even 30 years ago, to compare the current results to. And the real solid data that we have is from the millennium, which is why I quote that data, because it's actually really quite accurate, a combination of 3 or 4 different surveys that we do every year. So the real answer is we don't have that much good data from pre the millennium, but it's likely, at least since anecdotally people have reported seeing a lot more hedgehogs when they were younger. And of course, we know the habitat was different as well, and possibly a bit more hedgehog friendly in the rural areas, that there were in fact quite a few more hedgehogs. And studies that have looked at kind of densities have shown that we might still have hedgehogs widespread across the country in a lot of different areas, but perhaps the numbers of those hedgehogs in those areas have gone down.
Thank you. We had a question from Matthew, who was asking, when you had the slide with all the different projects going on for hedgehogs, he was just asking, do you know if there's any similar projects in Ireland?
That is a good question. So there is hedgehog research going on. There's been quite a few studies published, but they're more academic studies. So I imagine there's a lot going on in the universities there. I don't really know is the answer. I'm not so hot on the Irish studies, but there's definitely a lot of hedgehog research there. So there may well be, it might be worth checking. Hedgehog Street might know if you contact them, and they might well be able to forward you on.
Well, thank you. I see someone actually posted in the chat just after that a link to something in Ireland. So
great. I know that there's been a lot of talk about an app to track hedgehogs in Ireland. That's quite big. So I suspect there is quite a lot going on. So yeah, please do get signposted by Hedgehog Street.
Well, thank you. There's a question from Lawrence asking, do you know how far juvenile hedgehogs can disperse?
Again, there's been very little research on this. We don't know that much. Some disperse further than others. We know obviously that they can have a home range of up to 50 hectares. So, you know, they could be traveling beyond that. But there's really minimal research because hedgehogs are a nocturnal species, and because historically they've been quite difficult to track. Even now with GPS tracking, it's quite hard because once they go into a bush, their favourite places to be, the tracker can't get the signal to triangulate from the sky, so we often lose the signal. So they're quite difficult animals to pin these down.
Thank you. A question from Yanni asking, can you overfeed hedgehogs? We put out food and have 2 visits a night, but don't want to overfeed them, but then worried if we reduce the food then they might go, the first one might snaffle it all up.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I know that there have been reported cases of obese hedgehogs, and actually if they do get obese it can be a serious problem because they can't roll up properly, and that means obviously they're quite liable to predation. In all likelihood, if they were quite large nearer the autumn, they'd probably shed that weight in hibernation anyway. They should only be using the food that you put out as a supplement. Generally, they'll only take some of their food from the food that's put out for them, and then we will also naturally forage. I often get asked, oh, I'm going on holiday, what do? I can't feed my hedgehogs, are they going to die? when in reality they should be looking for other types of food anyway to supplement that. So it's unlikely, I would say, that they would get massively overweight. If you think they're looking pretty hefty, then maybe you could reduce it a little bit.
Thank you. Sorry, bear with me a second. I'm just reading through the chat. There's been a few different questions about cats as well, and cats are an issue for hedgehogs.
Yeah, so generally cats, quite characteristically, are curious. So they might paw a hedgehog if they see one, hiss at it. They soon realise that it's pretty prickly and tend to leave it alone. And there are documented cases all over the country and in scientific studies, and loads and loads of videos that show that cats and hedgehogs coexist quite happily. Cats will, of course, eat hedgehog food quite readily. So if you're putting food out for hedgehogs, then you might find that it's stolen by cats, which is quite annoying, particularly when we do footprint tunnel surveys. So when we do those surveys, we tend to try and put the food out as late as we can before night time. So the hedgehog has the highest chance of grabbing it before any cats when it comes out at night. Probably a bigger problem for hedgehogs are dogs. And I know this is quite a contentious issue because people love their dogs and they think that they are lovely and they wouldn't harm anything. And it often, dogs don't. But some dogs and different breeds, of course, are more likely to go for hedgehogs. Some terrier type breeds actually dig them out of their hibernation nests. It's what they do, they dig. And sometimes dogs will pick up hedgehogs and bite them. And obviously this can lead to the hedgehog becoming quite poorly. Also dogs potentially to a hedgehog smell quite like a fox. And fox are a natural predator of hedgehogs. So hedgehogs may well be avoiding a lot of our urban parks that are heavily dog walked, and that's something that we're looking into at the moment to see if that's the case.
Bro, thank you. Stephen was asking, are there any particular hedgerow plants that are good for hedgehogs?
Yeah, so generally the ones that are quite bushy and provide a good base, and not necessarily the type of species so much as the structure of the hedgerow plant is important. So anything, you know, like holly or hawthorn or blackthorn, or even things like hazel, you know, that provide some kind of structure at the bottom for a hedgehog to make their nest, are quite good. And of course, they're native species that will encourage native insects as well.
Oh, thank you. There was a question earlier from Lisa asking, do you need a license to go out and survey and handle hedgehogs?
Yeah, excellent question. So the great thing about footprint tunnel surveys is that you don't need a license to do those because you're not handling hedgehogs. However, for torchlight surveys and trapping surveys and other surveys that involve actively looking for hedgehogs to pick them up, you do need a license from Natural England. So that's it's a good point. It's probably something I should have mentioned, but it's one of the reasons that it's worthwhile looking out for surveys that are already set up in your area, because then you can get involved in those with somebody who's already licensed.
Well, thank you. There's another question from Lisa. She's asking, is there a way to tell different hedgehogs apart?
Individual hedgehogs, was that?
I think so, yeah. I think
yes, that's a good question. So to start with, males and females actually don't look that different. They're not really sexually dimorphic like they are in other species. So males tend to be a bit bigger than females, but the older they get, the smaller this difference becomes, until it's not really a difference at all. So you can only sex a hedgehog really by picking it up and uncurling it, which I wouldn't necessarily advise for the stress of the hedgehog, and also for you, it's quite hard to do unless you know how. And in terms of individuals, again, not really. You can sometimes pick out they've got different colorings, or they're different sizes, or one nose is longer than another, but it can be quite hard to tell them apart. Which is why we mark them with numbered plastic tubes on our torchlight survey, so we know exactly who is who.
And there was a question about those surveys as well before, just asking what glue you used to pick those numbers for the hedgehogs.
Yeah, good question. So we actually just use super glue. So you have to be really, really careful. This is one of the reasons you need a license to do it, because you need to be well trained so that you don't get the glue on the skin, because you don't want loads of glue stuck to the hedgehogs and they can't move the spines properly or anything. And so you need to just get it on the tube and that's it really. It doesn't harm the hedgehog. It's like our hair. It's like if you had a bit of glue in your hair, it doesn't hurt, so long as it doesn't go on the skin. We have trialed different methods over the years, us hedgehog people. We did, and still in some places do, use soldering irons to shrink the plastic onto the spine, again, very carefully and not getting the spine itself. But we find with the numbered tubes, the tubes have to be wide enough to fit the number on them, and therefore they're a bit too wide to be soldered on, and glue is the better method.
Thank you.
Hedgehogs do lose spines, like we lose our hair, which is why we put about 5 different markers on them, because they might just shed them during the next few months.
Ah, I see. Thank you. Right, I'm going to ask one more question. I'm conscious of the time now. There are a few people asking, can they only use the holes in the fences to get into the garden, or can you use steps or ramps or other things like that to help hedgehogs get in?
Yeah, you can use a wide range. They're pretty tenacious really about where they try and go. Generally they will move around the edges. So I mentioned like they might avoid the middle of an arable field, for instance, because it's quite exposed to predation for them. So they'll often hug the edges. So if you can make whatever it is obvious on the edge, that's probably your best bet of a hedgehog finding it. But yeah, certainly things like ramps, tubes, all sorts of things. They're quite inquisitive. They're not necessarily that fearful, so they'll go through most things. But about 13 by 13 centimetres is big enough really for the biggest of hedgehogs to get through. They do try and squeeze through other gaps.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Right, we're at the end then, unfortunately. I know there were a few questions in the chat. People were asking for the links to the books and things, but I'll send those round in the follow-up email for everyone that was asking about that. So thank you, Debbie, for joining us today, for taking the time to do that. It was a great presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. There's lots of you here today. I can see you waving.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Very
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.